you see people all the time saying that animal cognition is not as, animals are not as intelligent as humans, animals are not like humans, humans are completely apart from animals, and so there is a pushback against that to be like, well, hey, hold on a second. Do we really have the basis for being able to say that?
Well, ah, let me think.
All right.
I find that there's this aversion to the word intelligence, and that people who dislike the concept of intelligence go on to invent many constructs that have as a suffix intelligence. So they'll be like, yeah, no, intelligence is all that isn't all that matters. But there's also emotional intelligence, and there's also social. Wait. So you are prizing intelligence. Like so maybe you should stop that. Otherwise, you're implicitly saying intelligence does matter. We're just not defining it correctly. So does intelligence matter or not?
Complexity is another one of those words.
Like we prize complexity?
Yeah, there's a tendency. Shiloh and I have come into serious arguments over whether or not you can say that one thing is more complex than another. Like, is a biofilm more complex than a human?
Less complex, you mean?
Or,
Yeah. I
sorry,
mean, most
less
people would probably
complex.
think it's less. Yeah.
Yeah, is a human more complex than a biofilm? Sorry, I think I showed my hand there.
Hmm. Huh. Well, what do you say?
This is one of those questions where you were saying earlier that you start to spiral into the questions of, well, how do you define that? Where do you draw the line? What do you mean by complexity? What are you, what aspects of the biofilm are you looking at? And I honestly, I don't know in this case, because I can expand the nature of the biofilm in such a way where I begin to see it as a multicellular organism that has wants, desires, a master plan. It has separation of function. It has specific gene expression. It has evolution. It has growth and development and all of these things that we would say happen inside of us. And yet we look at it and we say that it's nothing like us. But this comes back to Thomas Gold's ideas, because if the biofilm is part of something larger, if it's part of an environment where it's communicating with lots of other bacteria, and they're all communicating with other funguses and microorganisms, and then there's an entire ecosystem that is built on the back of these unicellular organisms that are then behaving as multicellular organisms that are then part of a body, and we have no way of knowing what that body is or its limits or its functions. How can we possibly stand on the top of our little human mountain and say that we are more complex than it? What are you even saying? Do you know?
So, um, okay, but yes.
I love listening to your brain whir.
It's amazing.
Okay, going back to our conversation earlier about stating, well, trying to be honest with what's inside and being able to capture that with words and say it out loud. I find that it's such a difficult task because there are so many biases from all of us. And this is something that I didn't, so when I was first examining Toe, getting into Toe, I thought, hey man, these mathematicians, these physicists, these more Western types, they're extremely inclined in this analytic direction, and there's a bias there that I sense. And of course, I'm speaking only to a subset, and that's an overgeneralization. But from my experience with a limited set, this is what I saw. And so I was so eager to speak to more people on the Eastern or on the spiritual side. And I thought that they would be free from this. And I find that there's so much of a different sort of dogmatism. And I'm not someone who dislikes all dogmatism, by the way. I think that dogmatism has a salutary and a deleterious component, much like anything else. But there's a dogmatism for consciousness to be fundamental. Almost like they'll talk about, yeah, it's your fear that doesn't want consciousness to be fundamental. And then if you say, what if consciousness wasn't? What if it was an emergent property? You can see if they were on a lie detector, their heart palpitate. And their breathing changes and it becomes more chest-like and so on. As if... Well, and anyway, the point of that is to say that there's also this predilection for us to think that we're not special. And also, I think there's an egotism in that too. I think there's an egotism into talking about how little of an ego we have or one has. I see this so I see it from both sides. One that wants to say humans are primary, paramount. And another that wants to say, well, no, it's much more complex. And I'm not including you on that, Anastasia, please. I know this sounds like it's indirectly. I promise. That no, it's much more complex. And in fact, like, look, the cockroaches are far more intelligent because they're the ones who are going to outlast us in a nuclear bomb and so on. I just see that these conclusions are being drawn from such a place of preference. And it's so difficult. It's so difficult to get to the bottom of. When you ask that complexity question, you're right, it does spiral. And then I'm also thinking, well, how, like, entropy, interestingly, so you say something is more entropic than something else. Entropy is best thought of as well, forget about that. It's difficult to put a number to saying that this is complex, because there's a statement. Sorry, you can invert any situation, like a glass that falls and breaks. You say, well, that's much more entropic than the glass on the table. But if you were to snapshot that state and say, well, how likely is it to be that one state? That's one state has the same entropy as the glass on the table. So then I was thinking, well, complex relative to what? Relative to what condition? There are quite a few questions that come up. Do you find that... So how does your mind work when you go through these questions? Both of you, I'm curious. Like, when imagine Anastasia and Michael, you were asked the same question about complexity of the biofilm versus the human. What goes through your mind?